Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because we're finally going to answer the most common question I receive, and that's, is now a good time to buy Bitcoin? We're also going to take a look at inflation nowcasting from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland because we do have a very important CPI print next week, and we're going to talk about how these current expectations, if they do come to fruition, will impact markets and impact the Federal Reserve interest rate cut expectations for the rest of 2024. And of course, we'll also take a look at recent Bitcoin ETF inflows. We'll take a look at traditional markets and how they've been developing. And of course, we'll also take a look at some of the more important recent news events, but we're going to go ahead and start by answering this question because if you've been involved in this market for any prolonged period and people in your life know about it, I'm sure you receive this question very often, and really until I put together this simple visualization, I haven't really had a great way of answering it. Obviously, the answer has a lot to do with your time horizon. If you're a day trader, this framework is pretty useless because Bitcoin being undervalued under 50K doesn't really do much for you on a day-to-day time frame. But of course, I already know there's going to be hodlers in the comments telling me that Bitcoin is always undervalued because it's going to go up over the longer term. And of course, I do agree with you, but I don't think that helps us that much with short-term decision making and how allocated we actually want to be in the markets on a cycle to cycle basis. So this is really for investors thinking on a 1 to 3 year time frame, maybe thinking in terms of this cycle. And I really put this visualization together for myself so I can stay accountable to where Bitcoin really is in the cycle and whether it's currently at its fair value, overvalued, or undervalued. Let's go ahead and start by discussing why I labeled certain regions the way I did. I think Bitcoin is at a fair value between 50 and 70K because if you were buying Bitcoin today, you're buying it below the previous all-time high. Bitcoin was at these prices 3 years ago. And now that the ETFs have gone live, I do think Bitcoin is way more established and there's a lot less regulatory uncertainty. So if you're buying Bitcoin on a 1 to 2 year time horizon, I don't think you'll be upset buying at these prices. Of course, you're not going to 10x your money, which is why it's not very undervalued or a screaming deal at these prices. But if you had to buy Bitcoin today because you had zero exposure, I don't think you're buying at an absolutely terrible price as long as you're going to be holding it for the longer term. And of course, this works both ways. If you had to sell Bitcoin for whatever reason because you wanted to buy a new car because yours doesn't work half the time, or you wanted to buy a house because you've been tired of renting for the past decade, I don't think you'll feel that bad selling Bitcoin at these prices, even if it were to go higher, because you could significantly improve your quality of life by selling at these prices after such a strong move that we've seen over the past 18 months or so. Now, will I be selling at these prices? Am I interested in selling at what I consider to be fair value? Definitely not, because I don't need that money right now. That's why it's a long-term investment. But if I had to, I wouldn't feel terrible selling Bitcoin above 60,000 if there was really a need to. All right, and let's go ahead and explain why undervalued is labeled the way it is. I think that buying at the prices where the ETFs went live and buying close to the 50 and 200 week moving average is something you really can't go wrong doing on larger time frames. Being able to buy Bitcoin at its average price for the last 200 weeks, so essentially the average price over the last 4 years, is really not something you can go wrong doing, again, if it's for the longer term. And of course, if you're buying well under the 200-week moving average, I don't think price goes that low, as I explained in my last video with my different likelihoods of how low Bitcoin will go this cycle. But if we take a look at the very undervalued region, I think if you're able to buy anywhere near the bear market lows of 2022, that would likely be a very, very good entry for the longer term. But unfortunately, I don't think we'll see those prices unless we go into a very, very severe recession. I do think there's a decent likelihood that we might see the undervalued region. There could be some volatility. Maybe inflation ends up going a little bit higher than the market currently expects. Rate cuts get pushed back and that volatility sends Bitcoin lower, but I do think the very undervalued region is pretty unlikely. All right, and for me, the overvalued region is even more straightforward. If you're buying Bitcoin above 70,000, around 80 or 90,000, you're probably going to feel a lot of pain over the next year or two when we have larger corrections. I'm not saying I plan to sell all my Bitcoin at those prices. Maybe I would take some profits off my much lower entries, but I am definitely not interested in buying Bitcoin above 69,000, which is why I would consider it overvalued. And I would have a very hard time telling a new market participant to aggressively buy Bitcoin in this price region. And of course, very overvalued. This is, if Bitcoin were to go this high in 2024, I would be very tempted to sell quite a decent portion of my existing holdings. This chart would look incredibly vertical if that were to occur, and I would be very tempted to take some money off the table. And if we did see 100K Bitcoin this year, I would definitely not tell any friends and family to buy at those prices after this type of move over a 2-year period, and that's why I have it labeled as overvalued. And that's the general framework I'm going to be using for myself and what I'll be sharing with friends and family if they ask me about Bitcoin being overvalued or undervalued, or if now is a good time to buy. Again, these values apply to 2024. We'll readjust these maybe next year depending on what ends up happening with price. And of course, this doesn't apply to day traders or 10-year hodlers. This is for investors thinking about Bitcoin on a cycle to cycle basis. But of course, we'll monitor this as we go forward. But as of right now, Bitcoin is still well within the fair value region, almost directly in the middle of it. Now for this inflation expectation, right now the forecast is 3.5. I think markets would really panic if it came in higher at 3.6, because that would continue our 3 months in a row of uptrend that we've seen so far. If it comes in line with expectations at 3.5, I think that wouldn't look amazing, but it would definitely be less concerning than 3.6, and rate cut expectations would probably remain the same. But of course, if it came in below expectations at 3.4, I would expect rate cuts to move a little bit closer, and for risk assets like Bitcoin and the S&P 500 to perform well if that CPI print next week comes in below expectations. As for the ETF inflows, it's been pretty lackluster recently. Obviously, Grayscale was positive a couple of times for the first time ever, but we went back to a negative overall day yesterday with very minimal inflows or outflows. So for now, I think the market is still getting accustomed to these higher prices, and I really don't think there's any concerning signs in the short term in terms of a ton of outflows occurring. A lot of people began panicking on May 1st when we saw those outflows pick up steam, but now that it's cooled off again, I really don't think much can be gleaned from the recent ETF data, but it does look to be finding an equilibrium at current prices as of right now. As for the S&P 500, it's had a very nice bounce off that 20-week moving average like we expected. I still think it's likely to roll over here and test lower prices. Not guaranteed, and I do think that the inflation print we end up getting is going to decide what comes next for the S&P 500. If it comes in below expectations, markets probably continue higher. If it comes in line or above expectations, the S&P 500 likely rolls over and takes Bitcoin with it. In terms of news, I saw that Robinhood received a Wells notice from the SEC. I don't know how the SEC plans to fight all these cases at once. I mean, they're still in court with Coinbase. They're still kind of finalizing their case with Ripple. Now there's this stuff happening with I think it was MetaMask or Consensus. I think it was Consensus. So they're fighting all these cases. I don't really think this event matters that much. I think these cases are most likely going to be won by Robinhood and Coinbase. It's a great narrative to explain why prices are going down, but from what I've seen, these type of events just tend to be applied to whatever the recent price action is as a reason for why price went up or down. If prices went up on the day this news was published, people would have said, oh, look, we're finally getting closer to regulatory clarity. Robinhood is going to be fighting the SEC. This is great. But because prices went down that day, it was, oh my God, this is a big concern. Here, SEC is coming after Robinhood, but I really think it's a non-event because we've known the SEC has been fighting in court with these crypto companies for quite a while now, and I don't think Robinhood matters nearly as much as Coinbase does for this industry. In terms of portfolio updates, you guessed it, haven't changed anything yet. And honestly, now I have a very easy framework for myself as to why I'm not changing. I mean, if Bitcoin is fair value, I'm more than happy to enjoy my summer with my current allocations, knowing that if Bitcoin does skyrocket from here, I am well positioned for it. But if we do have a boring and painful summer and we get anywhere near undervalued prices, maybe we can talk about deploying some of that cash back into the market. But as of right now, I would rather just enjoy my summer knowing I'm positioned for both possible outcomes instead of having to spend my summer thinking about Bitcoin and worrying about feeling underexposed or overexposed to the market. As for Bitcoin dominance, we did get a very nice bounce off that 54% region we've had our eye on. Now we're going to find out if that's going to be a complacency bounce before Bitcoin dominance rolls over, or if it's going to continue higher here, because I think Bitcoin could still go lower this summer, and I do think there could be some downside for the S&P 500 thanks to stubborn inflation. I wouldn't be surprised if Bitcoin dominance continued higher here. But of course, a weekly close below 54% would be our invalidation for that thesis. And we're seeing continued weakness on Ethereum and Solana for now. They had some nice bounces last week with very clear buy pressure with these wicks, but we've seen continued sell-off this week. We do have Ethereum losing the 20-week moving average as of right now, but of course, we're going to wait for the weekly close before jumping to any conclusions. And of course, Solana, after a great bounce last week, now has a big wick to the upside and a pretty aggressive sell-off, of course, because it's being pulled down by Bitcoin. And we're going to wait for the weekly close on this one as well before jumping to any conclusions. But of course, as I always say in the end of my videos, currency devaluation isn't going anywhere. Deficits from the government aren't going anywhere. So long term, I think Bitcoin does well. It's fun to follow this stuff and be prepared for volatility in the short term. And of course, having these frameworks to kind of have an idea of where we are in the cycle are something I enjoy doing very much. But long term, in my opinion, Bitcoin can only go in one direction. And in my opinion, it's important to remember that because all of the volatility can sometimes make us forget the bigger picture. But anyway, thank you so much for the support on the recent video. Let me know what you think of where I put these different levels, whether you agree or not. But as always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.